And today we're in the middle of our series called Christian. Only got a couple of weeks left in it, and I feel like I've learned a lot in this series. I hope that you have too. I hope that it's been beneficial for you. And what we've been discovering, if like you haven't been keeping up with what we've been learning, or if it's like your first time here, what we've been talking about is that, what we've been talking about really in Christian is what a Christian is and what a Christian isn't. So that's basically what we've been talking about. And what we talked about is that this term Christian was a term that was come up with by people in the first century who weren't Christians to describe Jesus followers. But Jesus followers themselves didn't call themselves Christians. And Jesus didn't call his followers Christians. He called them something different. He called them disciples. Right? And the scary thing about that word is that it is so clearly defined in the Bible. The word disciple. See, like you can call yourself a Christian and believe just about anything you want to believe. You can call yourself a Christian and do just about anything you want to do. You can be on any side of any issue, anywhere, financially or politically or whatever it might be. Like, there's been Christians on both sides of like every war down throughout history. But if you decide to be a follower of Jesus, if you decide to be a disciple, well, that's different. And that's very clear in the Bible what that means, because Jesus so narrowly defines what his disciples are to be. In fact, Jesus said, if you forget everything else, here's the one thing that will let people know that you're my disciple. Do you remember what it was? If you love one another. Right, and then he said, and not just that you love one another, but I want you to love one another the way I have loved you. And that's really taking it up a notch, right? And we talked about last week how Jesus loved and how crazy that is for us. And Jesus said, you've got to love the way I loved, and then he lived it out. He illustrated it for us. And as we talked about last week, he did it in a remarkable way. You look at the Gospel of John, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the guy who wrote the Gospel of John, he said, as I watched Jesus, as I watched him live, and I watched him love, I think I figured out why he lived so well, and why he loved so well, and why he loved people in such a unique way. And I think I figured out how we're supposed to love each other, John said. And here's how he described it in John 1:14 that we looked at last week. He said, I think I figured it out. He said, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. That means Jesus showed up. God showed up. God moved into the neighborhood. So we have seen, John's talking about me and my friends, we have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. And John said, right there it is. That is the secret of how Jesus loved, is that he was full of grace and truth. Now, we all know what grace is. We all know what truth is. Grace is what says, hey, you're going to be all right. Truth is what says you have to work on it still. Grace is what says, hey, you're forgiven. Truth is what says, hey, you're accountable. Grace is what says, hey, you'll get it next time. Truth is what says, yeah, but you screwed up last time, right? And so there's this fullness of grace and truth. Like some of you grew up in grace and truth families. You grew up with equal doses of both, and you're a healthy, well-adjusted adult today. But for the rest of us, like some of us grew up in, like some of you grew up in houses where there was too much grace, right, and not enough truth, and that's why your clothes don't match even today, because nobody ever told you the truth. Yeah, I know. There's too much grace in your home. Some others of you grew up in homes that were too full of truth and not enough grace, and that's why you're like OCD to this day. You're like, everything's got to be just this way. Everything's got to be like this. It's got to be okay. It's got to be just like this, just so, because there wasn't enough grace. And all your friends are like, hey, take it easy on yourself. Like, no. It has to be this way. So if you were lucky, if you were fortunate, you grew up in homes where there were equal doses of both grace and truth, but not many of us did. Not many of us did. And here's what John said. John said, as best I can describe it, Jesus wasn't just the balance of these things. Jesus wasn't just the balance between grace and truth. Jesus was the full-on embodiment of it. In fact, he said that Moses gave us the law in the Old Testament, but when Jesus came, truth and grace were birthed. They were born in Jesus Christ, and he was full to the brim, full of grace and truth, that he was all of it together. So he wasn't just grace or truth. He was grace and truth. And we talked about this last week. Full to the brim of grace and truth. And John goes on to say, out of his fullness, we have received grace upon grace upon grace upon grace, because Jesus was full of both. All right? And so John says in some way, we've got to get here. In some way, for those of us who are followers of Jesus, those of us who are disciples, we've got to get here. We can't go too far to this side or too far to this side. We've got to try to embody both. All right, and it's easy to go one way or the other, but if we want to be like Jesus, we've got to figure out how to get right here. We need to figure out how to embody grace and truth. Now, last week I gave you a bunch of examples from Jesus' life. We talked about the woman at the well, how he lived this out. We talked about the woman who was caught in adultery, how he lived this out. We talked about Matthew, the tax collector, how Jesus lived it out there. We talked about the thief on the cross, how Jesus lived out this truth there, how he embodied grace and truth. But today I want to take you to this portion of Scripture where Jesus actually teaches this. Okay, last week we talked about how he modeled it. This week we're going to talk about how he actually taught it. And the thing that makes this so amazing is when you think about who he was talking to. We're going to be in Luke 15, if you have your Bibles today. Luke 15, it'll be up here on the screen if you don't. But when you think about who Jesus is talking to, this is what makes this teaching so remarkable. Jesus is in this room, probably somebody's house, and he finds himself with two different groups of people on either side of the room. On one side of the room are the sinners and the tax collectors. And remember last week we talked about how tax collectors were considered even lower than sinners. They had their own category of sin in first century Judaism. So you had the sinners and the tax collectors over on one side, but then on the other side of the room were all the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. And all these people are crammed into this room to hear Jesus. On one side are the sinners, on one side are the self-righteous people, and they're all here to hear Jesus. On one side of the room is a group of people who felt like God would never accept them. And on the other side of the room were people who thought that if God didn't accept them, something must be wrong with God. All right? And so Jesus looks at these two groups of people who are sitting on either side of the room, and he knows they're both wrong. He knows that they're both wrong, and he wants to teach them about how wrong they both are. But because Jesus is the master teacher, Jesus is the greatest preacher, teacher that has ever walked the face of the earth. He is the best communicator who has ever walked the face of the earth. Instead of just telling them, hey, guys, you're both idiots, all you guys, you're all idiots. Instead of just dressing it head on, like we tend to do, Jesus says, you know what? Let me tell you a story. Story time. Let me just tell you a story. And he illustrates his point in this story. Instead of just starting with flat out, you're wrong, he says, let me tell you a story. And so he tackles this really heavy theological issue with a story. And this really heavy issue of what does God look like? And what does God being a God of grace and truth look like? And what does it look like to be that kind of person? He tackles it with a story. And I love that about Jesus. This is found in Luke 15. In fact, if you grew up in Sunday school, you probably know at least half this story. If you didn't grow up in church, you probably heard this at some point in your life. So let me just read the first verse to you. Luke 15:1, and this first verse is huge to me. Luke 15:1 says, now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus. And if we just stopped right there, we could take the rest of the day and just talk about that. Because the tax collectors and the sinners were the ones coming to church, basically. They were the ones cramming in to hear this rabbi teach. Now that's different than most of our church experiences, right? We think of the church as being a place that, okay, everybody's kind of good people, and, well, we're all kind of following Jesus, we're all Christians, we've all made a profession of faith. But in Jesus' day, when he was teaching, all the bad people came. All the worst of society came to hear Jesus. Now, that's different, right? But this is why when we embody grace and truth, everything changes. Even the people who show up to hear the message changes. When we embody grace and truth. That's just the way Jesus taught. Then he goes on in verse 2. Basically the front row is filled with the worst people in society. And in verse 2, it says, but the Pharisees and the teachers of the law over on the other side, they muttered, this man, Jesus, welcomes, as in he embraces, as in he invites them in, as in, hey, I saved a seat for you guys, come in. He embraces these sinners and eats with them. And eating with them was a very intimate thing. They didn't have McDonald's and Taco Time, and it wasn't like you went to a restaurant back in Jesus' day. When you ate with someone, you were invited into their home, right? So it was a very intimate thing to share a meal with someone. And all these self-righteous people are looking at Jesus, and they just can't figure this out because Jesus isn't anything like these sinners. Jesus isn't anything like these tax collectors, and yet they're drawn to him like a moth to a flame, right? They just keep coming to see Jesus, and all the Pharisees and the teachers of the law are over here going, what? Why is that? We can't figure this out. What is wrong with this guy? And there's so much tension in the room like you could cut the tension with a knife, and they're all wondering, well, does he like condone what they're doing then? All the teachers of the law are saying, well, he must condone what they're doing. And they're muttering to each other. Have you ever heard him say that, they shouldn't be sleeping around? No, I haven't heard that. You ever heard him say that they shouldn't be collecting taxes? No, I haven't heard that. Well, then he must condone it. And they're trying to figure this out. But the issue that they're looking at is really the issue of navigating grace and truth, and they didn't even realize it. So Jesus decides to tackle this. He decides to teach about this. But again, because he's the master teacher, he doesn't just hit them head on with the truth. He tells them a story. So he begins by talking about something that they can all relate to. People on both sides of the room can relate to what Jesus tells them. He decides to talk about sheep and about shepherding, and he tells them a parable. And if you don't know what a parable is, it's a made-up story that illustrates a truth. Right? It's a fictitious story that illustrates something that is very, very deeply true. So Jesus says in verse 4, he begins with this story. He says, suppose one of you, any of you in this room, suppose one of you has 100 sheep and loses one of them. So Jesus begins with this common emotion because everybody knows what it's like to lose something. Right? Even we can relate to that. We know what it's like to lose something. And everybody on both sides of the room are like, okay, yeah. And he says, if you lose one of your sheep, he says, doesn't he leave the 99 in the open country and go after the lost sheep until he finds it? And maybe for the first time in their lives, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law and the sinners and the tax collectors are all agreeing on something. They're all like, yeah, of course. Yeah, if I had 100 sheep and I lost one, of course I would go look for the lost sheep. And they're looking at each other on the other side of the room, maybe like, okay, this makes me nervous because they're shaking their heads too. They're agreeing too. What's up with that? But they're saying, he says, did you know, Jesus, before they can even ask a question, he says, did you know that there is more rejoicing in heaven over something that was lost being found than everything that was found that was never lost? And before they can put it together, he sees some women in the audience. He says, let me tell you another story. He says, women, if one of you has a precious coin, he says, isn't it true that if you lost that precious coin, you would take all the furniture out of the house and sweep every corner of the house until you found it? And all the good women and all the bad women are all like, yeah, of course, yeah, I would look for my precious coin. And all the husbands of those good women and those good bad women are all like, yeah, of course, I would help her too. I'd come home and help her move the furniture. We would look for that lost coin because it was precious to us. And when something is lost, what Jesus is saying here, what he's illustrating is that when something is lost, all of a sudden, it has your undivided attention, right? Like you could have lots of other coins, but the moment you lose one, all of a sudden that coin becomes more important than all the ones that you still have, right? Like I think if Jesus were telling this parable today, he might say something like, imagine you lost your cell phone. Wouldn't you go look for it? And we would all be like, yeah, of course, if I lost my cell phone. It's precious to me. Precious, right? It's precious to me. And we would say, yeah, Jesus, of course. We would go look for the phone. Like, have you ever lost your phone? I had lunch with David this week, and I left my phone at home. And I was just going to Kent. I knew where I was going. But because I didn't have my phone and my GPS, I felt like I was just going out into the wilderness alone. And I was like, I'm on city streets, but all I could think about was, oh God, if I get lost, geez, I was like praying, Lord, please, I don't know what's going to happen to me. And I was just going down the street. But, and that's what Jesus is saying. All of a sudden, when you lose something that you care about, when you lose something that's precious to you, all of a sudden, it has your undivided attention. It's all you can think about, right? Do we agree with that? Yeah. So did everybody else in the room that Jesus was in. They all agreed on this because they all had lost something and they got what he was saying. And he said, did you know, before they can ask questions, he says, did you know that God is more excited about a lost sinner, a lost person returning to fellowship with him than he is with the 99 who never left to begin with? And before they can put all that together, before they can put it all together, he says, let me tell you one more story. So they're all still, their heads are swimming with all these ideas. And Jesus says, let me tell you one more story. He says, there was a man who had two sons, an older son and a younger son, a firstborn and a secondborn. And Jesus understood birth order before that was even a thing. Like, that's a whole branch of psychology now, right? Birth order. And Jesus gets to the heart of this. He says the older son that this man had was the behavior, and the younger son was the misbehavior. I know those aren't real words, but just go with it. Okay, quick question, too. How many of you are firstborn kids? All right, good. So we can relate to, like, we're the good kids, right? I'm a firstborn, too. No offense, younger kids, middle kids, but we are the good ones. Like, your siblings aren't even in church today, right? No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. Please don't take that seriously. I'm just kidding. But that's kind of the stereotype, though, right? The firstborn, they're the ones who, like, you know, they always are the leaders. They're always the ones who do everything that mom and dad asks. And then there's that stereotype that the younger kids tend to get away with more things. It was that way in my family, and that's just kind of a stereotype. But and so Jesus understood this, and this was even more like a stereotype in Jewish culture in the first century. And so he says that this man had a firstborn son, and again, this is just a story, but Jesus says this man had a firstborn son, and he was the one who always did everything right. But the younger son, not so much. Not so much. He said the younger son, the younger brother, the secondborn comes to his father and basically says to his father, Dad, I wish you were already dead. Like, Dad, I wish you were dead so you would just give me my inheritance and I could get out of this one-horse town. Right? I want to go to the city. I want to have all the money that is coming to me, and I wish you would die already. Now, everybody in Jesus' audience, like, that's offensive even to us, right? Everybody in Jesus' audience was even more offended than we are, because this is first century Jewish culture. It is very patriarchal. And they're saying, and Jesus is saying, here comes this young son, the baby of the family, coming to his dad saying, Dad, why don't you die already and let me get what's coming to me? So everybody in the room, the sinners and the tax collectors and the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, everybody is offended. Everybody thinks, what a jerk. What a terrible son. Everybody in the audience is agreeing with one another. They are all offended. And then Jesus has them right in the palm of his hand. And because he can take this story any way he wants to go, he says, guys, you won't believe what else the son did. Once he got the money, his dad actually did it. His dad actually sold his stock, sold the stuff that he had, gave his son his inheritance, and then the son left home. Didn't even say thanks. Left home and went to the big city to live it up. And all of a sudden, well, not all of a sudden, but after a little while, the son was in the big city, living it up, and everybody's just like, oh, I can't believe this son. As he was in the city, he got involved in things that he shouldn't be involved in. He spent all the money that he had, and before he knew it, all his money was gone. And now everybody in the audience, in the room that Jesus is teaching in, is like, good. Right? They're all like, he's gonna get what's coming to him. They think they're excited. They want to hear the rest of this story. And maybe you've heard this story. He got into the big city. He couldn't afford the way he was living for very long. Everybody in the room is angry at this young son. And then Jesus says, wait, you're not going to believe it. It gets even worse, guys. He says, a famine came to that part of the country. And this young man ran out of money. He couldn't find a job. And this young Jewish boy, the only job he could find was feeding pigs. And everybody in Jesus' audience is like, yes! He's getting what he deserves. Yes! And they all agreed with his teaching. And they're like, where's this going? And then he becomes so hungry, Jesus says. Then the young boy became so hungry, and he couldn't find a job, and he had squandered his inheritance. He got so hungry as he was tending those pigs and feeding those pigs, he thought, maybe I should just eat the slop that the pigs are eating. Young Jewish boy. Now, you know how Jews feel about pork, right? So this is like the ultimate extreme. This young Jewish boy who had it all of a sudden comes to a point in his life where he thinks, maybe I should just fill my belly with the stuff that the pigs are eating. And everybody in the room, like if Jesus would have stopped the story right there, everybody in the room would have burst into applause. They would have been like, yes, that's the best story I've ever heard. And they would have gone home that night. They would have been like, son, let me tell you a story, right? They would have sat around the dinner table that night like, son, sit down. Let me tell you a story. I heard this from this Jesus of Nazareth guy today. Sit down. Let me tell you what happens if you disobey your father, right? Let me tell you what happens if you disobey your parents. Let me tell you what God is like. You reap what you sow, son, and you will get what's coming to you. What goes around comes around. That's the way God works. That's the way the world works. So go clean your room. Right? Right? That's exactly what they would have done. If Jesus would have stopped there, they would have thought it was the best story they'd ever heard. This young, privileged Jewish boy, driven to think that, man, I've just got to eat what these filthy, nasty pigs eat. So Jesus has everybody in the room on the edge of their seats. And he goes on. He doesn't stop the story there. He says in verse 17, if you see this, he says, when he came to his senses, he said to himself, how many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and I am here starving to death? I will set out and I will go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. And to let you know that I'm really serious about this, Dad, I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. Verse 20 says, so he got up and he went to his father. And everybody in the audience all of a sudden is like, no way, it's getting better. Everybody in the audience is like, he's got to face the music now. He's got to go home to his dad and own up to what he's done. This is the best story ever. And they can't wait to see where Jesus is going to take it. And then Jesus, who's making this whole story up, it's a fictitious story, he's making it up to make a very emotional point that no one would have agreed with if he would have just started with the point itself. He says in verse 20, he says, but while the son was still a long way off, his father, whom he had betrayed, whom he had alienated, whom he had said, Dad, I just wish you would die, his father saw him and was filled with, and if Jesus would have asked them to fill in the blank, if he would have stopped right there and says, what do you think he was filled with, guys? They all would have said, anger, righteous indignation. There's no way that father could be filled with anything else. I know how I would feel if it was my son. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. And he ran to his son. The father ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. Kissed him on his dirty, stinking cheek. And now everybody that's listening to this, all the Pharisees on this, or all the sinners and the tax collectors on this side, all the Pharisees and the teachers of the law on this side, they're all confused. Because they all know, they've heard Jesus tell these kind of stories before, and they know that usually the Father represents God, and the other person in the story represents us. And so they've kind of been piecing this together as Jesus is telling the story. They're kind of piecing together, the Father in this story is God, and the younger story are the sinners. And yet here Jesus says the Father was filled with compassion for the younger son and ran to him and threw his arms around him and kissed him. This stinking, low-down, good-for-nothing son. The Father throws his arms around him with no inhibition and kisses him on the cheek. And then the son said to the father in verse 21, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. And nobody argues with that, right? Verse 22, he says, but the father said to his servants, quick. And that word quick bothers me because, like, if it were my son, I think I might be like, well, let's see if this is going to stick. Right? Let's see if he's really serious about this. Let's see if this is just like a jailhouse confession. Let's see if he just wants more money. But no, the father says, quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet, which means my son is going to be my son. Oh yeah, by the way, bring the fatted calf, he says. Verse 23, bring the fatted calf and kill it. We've been saving that for somebody's wedding or for somebody's graduation. Bring it out because we're going to have a feast and celebrates. That's a great story, right? Parable of the prodigal son. And if you grew up in Sunday school, this is where the story ended. If you know this story, if you've heard it before, like this is the end, right? This is where the story ends. But this is only the beginning. This is only the beginning of the story. And I would argue, because remember, at the beginning of the story, Jesus said the father had how many sons? He had 2 sons. And Jesus goes on to talk about the older brother, the firstborn. And I would argue, guys, that the parable of the prodigal son is really more like the parable of the angry brother. I think that whoever titled it the parable of the prodigal son got it wrong. I think really the greater point that Jesus is making is when you look at who he's talking to, the point, the emphasis is on the older brother. Because you think about it, here he is, the behavior, the firstborn, the one who's always done everything right. And in the story, Jesus says he was out in the field and he was working when his younger brother came home. He's out there finishing up his day like a good son would. And he and his servants are maybe heading back to the house, and he sees the house in the distance, and he sees all this dust kicking up, and he sees people running into the house, and he sees dancing, and he can hear music coming from the distance. And so he's like, what's going on at the house? And one of the servants runs up to him, and he's got the fatted calf. He's bringing it on a wagon, bringing the fatted calf, and the older brother is like, wait, that's my calf. That was for my wedding. That was for my graduation. What's happening? He's going to be mad at his dad for this. He's like, what's going on? Frank is pulling the wagon. He's bringing the calf in. That was for my celebration. And one of the servants says, you're not going to believe it. Your brother's back. And he runs into the house. And all of a sudden, everyone in the room identifies with the older brother. Because if I had a younger brother that did that to my dad, I know how I'd feel. I know how I'd feel about that brother. And Jesus has everyone in the room right where he wants them. He's telling this story. The sinners on this side and the Pharisees on this side, they all of a sudden, it clicks with them. Hey, the older brother has a right to be angry. And Jesus says the older brother, in verse 28, the older brother became angry. The older brother became angry and refused to go in. And this is the crux of the story. This is the point of the story. Because let me ask you something. Let's bring this down to a real personal level. Have you ever met any angry Christians? Have you ever met any angry religious people? Did you grow up like an angry nun if you went to a Catholic school, or an angry pastor if you're Protestant? You ever been flipping through the channels and you come across a TV preacher and you're just like, that guy's just mad at everybody? Like, you ever do that? Did you ever leave a church because you were tired of all the angry, disputatious Christians that Ann Rice talked about a few weeks ago? You ever leave a church because of that? It's like you can't figure out. It's like they believe in hell and they enjoy it. Like they enjoy the thought of hell. They enjoy the thought of everybody else going there. What's up with that? Why are so many religious people so angry? Why are so many Christians so angry? Why is it that they're against everything? Like, we don't even know what they're for. We just know that they're against everything. I mean, I know that Jesus loves me, but did anybody tell these Christians that? He was angry and refused to go into the celebration. So let me kind of review. So you've got a dad who's throwing a party. He's invited the neighborhood, invited the community. There's dancing, there's singing, there's alcohol. He's killed the fatted calf. There's lots of people involved. And on one side of the house is a son who doesn't think he deserves to come in. And on the other side of the house is a son who is angry and refuses to come in. So neither one of them wants to be at the party. And there's a dad, there's a father who's like, I just want to have a celebration. And everybody in Jesus' audience that day was confused because none of them understood what God the Father is like. None of them understood, and many of us don't understand how God views sinners. And he, instead of just saying it, he tells them a story. He goes on in verse 28. He says, the older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father, who represents God, his father went out to the older brother and pleaded with him. The father went to the older brother and pleaded with him. He pleaded with him. He said, son, I know you're angry, but I want you to come to the party. And the older brother said, no, Dad, I don't want to come to the party. He answered his father in verse 29, look, all these years I've been slaving for you, and I've never disobeyed your orders. All these years I've worked for you, Dad. I've worked, and I've been good, and this isn't fair. This should be my party. I don't want to come to the celebration for my younger brother. I don't want to. It isn't fair. Now, here's the thing. Can I just mess with you for a second? Here's the thing. Some of us are the older brother. Some of us are the older brother. You feel like you've been serving God for so long, and you've always been so good, and you look down on people who don't know God like you do. And you're angry. Look, all these years I've been slaving for you, God. And do you know why you're angry? Do you know why you're an angry Christian? Now, I don't care if you get mad at me, but Let me tell you why you're angry. You're angry because you think you deserve something from God that somebody else might get. You think that you have been so faithful and obedient. You stayed in that marriage. You tithed to your church. You were always faithful. You disciplined your kids. And you did so many good things. And the holier you get, the angrier you get. And I'll tell you why. Because you are not this. You're not this. You might have truth, but you don't have grace. And every time you hear about bad people and good things happening to them, it just deepens your belief in hell. Well, one day they'll get what's coming to them. One day. And you find yourself secretly rejoicing in the pain of others. And you wish the parable had ended with the younger brother eating the slop of the pigs. You wish it would have finished up there, getting what he deserves, reaping what he sowed. And you're angry, and you're self-righteous, and you're not like Jesus. And you're not a very good disciple. You're not a very good follower. Now, people might think you're a good Christian, because you can define that however you want to. I'm telling you, you can start a whole political party around this kind of Christianity. You can start a whole movement around this kind of Christianity. You can boycott everything under the sun in the name of this kind of Christianity. But you're not like Jesus. He answered his father, "Look, all these years I've been slaving for you, and I never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never even gave me a young goat so that I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property," right, Dad, you've worked all your life for this, and he squandered it with prostitutes. Dad, I hate to break it to you, but there were prostitutes involved. Don't tell Mom. He squandered it with prostitutes, and he comes home, and yet you kill the fatted calf for him. And Dad, I'm mad. That bothers me. That's not fair. But how does the father respond? Verse 31. The father said, "My son, you are always with me." What? What's that? You are always with me. Dad, are you trying to change the subject? Like, did you hear a word I just said? Son, you are always with me. What does that have to do with anything? It has everything to do with everything. This is what I value the most, that you have always been with me, and now your brother is with me too. Everything I have, he says in verse 31, everything I have is yours. I'm not going to resplit up everything, son. It's not going to be like 25% to you. You have everything coming to you. I haven't forgotten you. You are getting your reward. You are always with me. But in verse 32, we had to celebrate and be glad. Glad? Why would we be glad? Because this brother of yours was dead. He was not with us, and now he is alive. He is now with us. He was lost. He was not with us, and now he is found. He is with us. And I need you to come to the party. This isn't about performance. This isn't about getting what you deserve. This isn't about sowing and reaping. This is about being with your Father. That's why I'm having the party. I don't know what you're so mad about. I don't even get the issue. All that stuff you just told me, it's all true. All that stuff about working hard and getting what you deserve, it's true. But that's not even what this is about. This is about being with your Father. Now you need to go talk to your brother because he's hung up on the same thing. You think this party is about performance. He thinks this party is about performance, but it's not. It's about proximity. He doesn't think he's good enough. Go talk to him. That's not why I threw the party. I want to be with you. And I want to be with him. So come in. Do you know the roots of following Jesus, really? Do you know the heart of being a disciple, really? And this is uncomfortable, but it'll change your life. And this will change the world. What's at the heart of all of this is the truth that God could never love you less. There's nothing you could do to make God love you less. And there's nothing you could do to make him love you more. And the corollary to that is that every person you're ever eyeball to eyeball with is somebody that God loves so much that He couldn't love them anymore. And there's nothing that person could do. There's nothing that person could do to God. There's nothing that person could do to you that would make God love them less. Nothing. You know where our anger comes from? You know where our anger comes from when we're angry at people who don't know Jesus? It comes from self-righteousness. It comes from this somewhere in the back of your mind where you're thinking, I have been faithful. I have been in church. I. And God says, that's awesome. You've always been with me, but that's not the issue. The issue is not performance. The issue is with. And when you and I, when we get this, when this saturates our thinking, when this works out all of our self-righteousness and gets to the heart and the root of what it means to follow Jesus, what we'll find is that sin will always break our hearts. But we won't get condemning at people. We won't be condemning towards people. We won't just condemn people to hell. It'll break our hearts, but we won't be mad at them. It'll break our hearts. We'll be sad, but we won't just be angry at them and hope they go to hell. When somebody is in sin, when somebody's living in sin, when somebody moves in the direction of sin, when a whole segment of society embraces sin, it will break our hearts, but we will still want them at the party. We will still want them at the party. And when they take that first step back towards home, we will be the ones to run out to them and throw our arms around them and kiss them on the cheek. Because that's how God loves. That's grace and truth. Listen, when Jesus said that the Father chose to throw a party, it wasn't thrown for those who had been consistently faithful. It wasn't for the older son. It was about somebody who was not with, who was now with. And if that bothers you, I am so glad. I'm so glad if that bothers you, if it messes with you. I want you to think about that. Why does that bother you so much? I want you to wrestle with that. I want you to go home and pray about this because I want me and I want you, I want us as a church to learn to become more and more comfortable carrying the tension of grace and truth. And like we said last week, that is messy and it's uncomfortable and we don't always know what to do with it, but we've got to get here. We've got to. We've got to refuse to let go of either of these things, grace and truth, because if we let go of one, we lose something. We lose something. And in closing, I just want to say this. To those of you who are the prodigal, and I mean, come on, we've all been there. Maybe you're there right now. Some of you, maybe you feel like the prodigal son. You feel like you've turned your back on God and you know it. And some of you, let me just use an old-fashioned term, some of you are living in sin, right? You backslidden or whatever you want to say those old-fashioned terms are, and you know it, and there's this tension in your life. And you know that you're not right with God, and God and I want to say to you, come back home. Come back home because there's a party waiting for you. There's a celebration waiting for you. And we're not mad at you. We're not mad at you because we know that sin has a gotcha, and it breaks our hearts. And we don't want sin to get you. When sin goes bad, there are scars that you'll never heal from. And I know because I have them. I've been a prodigal. And many of us in this room, I mean, let's be honest, all of us at some point have been the prodigal. We've been the prodigal long enough to know that it's better to be with than to be apart. So come back home. And I want you to know that whatever you've done, whatever returning means to you, whatever coming home means to you, that when you come home, this church isn't going to be a place that holds up a list of your dirty laundry. We're not going to hold up a list and say, what about this and that and this and that? We're going to be a place that throws our arms around you, kisses you on the cheek, figuratively speaking, and welcomes you home. And we're going to celebrate. We're not going to be like the older brother who was angry and refused to go in. To put it in Jesus' terms, we have to celebrate. We have to celebrate, and we will always celebrate and be glad when a prodigal comes home. because this brother or sister of ours who was dead is now alive. They were lost, and now they've been found. That's why Jesus came. Jesus said, I have come to call the righteous, not the righteous, but the unrighteous. I've come to seek and save the lost. So today my prayer is that for those of you who are prodigals, that God would stomp out your unrighteousness. And for those of us who are like the older brother, that God would stomp out our self-righteousness. And that we would all come to the party. We'd come to the celebration that the Father is throwing. And in the process that we would become individuals and that we would become a church who is characterized by grace and truth. Would you stand with me? I just want to pray for you guys as David comes back up.